My historical question is, when did the followers of Jesus start believing that he was God? Throughout Christian history, there have been numerous ways that people have understood how Jesus is God. Let me tell you what really happened at the Council of Nicaea with regard to the Arian controversy. There was a influential Christian leader in Alexandria, Egypt, named Arius. Arius developed his theological views in ways that he thought were perfectly orthodox, perfectly true and correct and biblical. His view about Christ was that Christ was God. Christ was a divine being. He was the Son of God and he was God. But how could Christ be God if God was God and there not be two gods? And how can God the Father be almighty and Christ be almighty? If they're both almighty, then neither of them is almighty. Only one being can be almighty. And so Arius maintained that in eternity past, God the Father alone existed, but he wasn't the Father yet. God begot a Son. God, in effect, brought Christ into being as a second-level divinity, a secondary divinity. He wasn't equal to God. Nobody can be equal with God the Father. He was a secondary-level divinity. There was a time before which Christ did not exist. In other words, Christ came into being at a certain point in time as a secondary divinity, lower than God the Father. Christ then, through the power of the Father, created the universe. And Christ became a human being to die on the cross. That was Arius' view. This view was a popular view throughout much of Christendom. The basic view had been around for a long time, although Arius formulated it in particularly persuasive ways. And after Arius' day, people continued to hold this view. His bishop in Alexandria was a man named Alexander. Alexander took exception to Arius' view. In Alexander's view, there never was a time when Christ did not exist. Christ had always existed. He wasn't begotten by God at some point in time. He had always been begotten by God. And he wasn't a secondary divinity. He was equal with God the Father. God the Father and God the Son are completely equal in every way, and they always have been forever and ever. That was Alexander's view. There was a big debate about this that led ultimately to the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. A council of bishops from around the world, mainly from the eastern part of Christianity, bishops from around the world who came together to debate the issue. They debated the issue, and they ended up agreeing not with Arius, but with Alexander. That became the standard view that came to be incorporated in the document that is called the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed is still recited by people in various Christian denominations today. It was a foundational document that emerged ultimately out of this Council of Nicaea in the year 325. This creed is particularly concerned to define who Christ is. And here are some of the statements from the creed. Jesus Christ is the only Son of God. He's eternally begotten of the Father, not just temporarily at one time, but he's eternally begotten of the Father. He is God from God, light from light, true God from true God. He's begotten, he's not made. He never came into being. He's always existed. He's begotten, he's not made. And he's of one being with the Father. God the Father and God the Son have the same essence. They are of the same substance. They are co-eternal, co-powerful. They are equal in every way and always have been. This was the view that came out of the Council of Nicaea, when Christ is fully God. So the Council of Nicaea is not when they decided was Jesus going to be the Son of God. Everybody at the Council of Nicaea agreed that Jesus was the Son of God. The question is, in what sense is he the Son of God? And one side won those debates. That's the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. Let's go back to an earlier period, to the earliest gospel that we have that talks about Jesus to see whether it has a similar view of Jesus or not. The earliest gospel we have in the New Testament is the Gospel of Mark. Mark has a very interesting and compelling view of Jesus. Among other things, Mark certainly thinks that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Mark's gospel begins by saying that it is the gospel of the Messiah, of Jesus the Messiah, and throughout the gospel, Jesus is called the Son of God. It's very interesting, though, who knows that Jesus is the Son of God in the Gospel of Mark? Now, I'm not talking about what John says or what Luke says or what Matthew says. I'm thinking Mark wrote his Gospel, and if somebody read his Gospel, what would they think about Jesus? Well, they'd think he was the Son of God. But who in the narrative of Mark knows that Jesus is the Son of God? The interesting thing about Mark, again, this is common knowledge. This is nothing weird to me. And you'll see it yourself if you just read Mark's gospel. The strangest thing about Mark's gospel is that nobody can figure out who Jesus is. Nobody can figure out who he is. The reader knows who he is because Mark tells you he's the Son of God. And you read the gospel, you realize he's doing all these miracles. He's the Son of God. But nobody in the story knows that he's the Son of God. And then comes a key moment in Mark's gospel, halfway through the narrative. Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he asks them, "Who do people say that I am?" And the disciples say, "Well, some say that you're John the Baptist, come back from the dead. Some say you're Elijah, the great prophet, or one of the other prophets." And Jesus says, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And Peter replies, "You are the Messiah." And Peter replies, "You are the Messiah." For Mark, Jesus has to suffer and die. He is the Messiah because he's the suffering Messiah. This is a long way from the controversy over Arianism. When Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am?" the disciples don't reply, "Well, some people think that you're equal with the Father and have always existed, and there never was a time before which you did not exist. And, well, some of us actually think that we think the opposite. We think, in fact, you did come into being at some point in the eternity past." That is not the issue. It's nowhere near the issue. It is not discussed in the Gospel of Mark. It's a completely different business. And so my question, how do you get from point A to point B? How do you get from Mark's understanding of Jesus as the Messiah who has to suffer for the sins of the world to Alexander's understanding of Jesus as a person who is co-equal with God, as powerful as God, equal with God in every way, who's existed eternally from eternity past? How do you get from one to the other? Well, I have a thesis about that. Sorry, you can't see thesis very well, but this is a thesis. First, during Jesus' lifetime, his disciples did not believe he was God. That should not be controversial. In Mark, they can't even figure out what kind of Messiah he is, let alone whether he's God or not. The issue, are you God or not, doesn't come up in the Gospel of Mark. During his lifetime, Jesus' followers didn't have any inkling that he was God. But after Jesus' lifetime, his disciples did believe he was God. There's one thing that changed their mind. They came to believe in the resurrection. The resurrection is the absolute key. Why did the followers of Jesus come to believe that he had been raised from the dead? The Romans believed that the founder of the city of Rome, Romulus, had been taken up to heaven at his death. There's a story about it in the Roman historian Livy. Romulus, who has founded the city, and the city's going strong, the Senate is in place, they've got a functioning army. Romulus and the senators are sitting next to each other on a platform like this, and the army is marching in front of them as a parade. A thunderstorm comes up, we're told in Livy, and it grows dark, and a fog comes, and when the fog lifts, Romulus isn't there anymore. He's not on his throne. What happened to him? What they said happened to him is that he got taken up to heaven. And at that point, they started worshiping him as a god. He became the god Quirinus, who was one of the three main deities, one of the three main gods for ancient Rome. This was Romulus, the man, taken up to heaven, became a god. Not just in Roman circles, but in Jewish circles. There were Jewish thinkers at the time of the New Testament who thought that Moses had been taken up into heaven at his death and had become a god. We have clear evidence of this from Philo, the Jewish philosopher who taught in Alexandria, Egypt. Philo wrote several books about Moses, in one of which he says that when he died, he was taken up into heaven and he became a divine being. He became a god-like figure. Not just pagans, but also Jews thought an exalted figure who went up to heaven when he died became a god. Jesus was thought to have been a person who went up to heaven. What are the followers of Jesus supposed to think if Jesus has gone up to heaven? Well, they think what anybody would think. They think that he had been made a divine being. And so the earliest Christological views, in other words, the earliest views of who Christ was, are views that at the resurrection, God made Jesus a divine being. It was at the resurrection that Jesus became a divine being. It's at the resurrection that Jesus became the Son of God.